Well, thank you so much for that wonderful opening lecture. And I have a question that came in about the degree to which, well, first I should ask, do you all have questions of one another? Maybe you should start there. Or comments.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Stickgold. First of all, amazing, mind-blowing presentations from both of the first two speakers. But one of the things I'm curious about is learning about the role of dreams in memory consolidation and sort of the seeking of old memories and trying to find new applications for them. And this may be a completely unanswerable question, but why does our brain not know that we're doing that? I mean, so much of the cultural tradition about dreams has to do with, predicting the future or getting prophecies or so on. It's about things completely external to the self and to memories. Any thoughts about why the brain would want to sort of camouflage this amazing learning?
What a great question. I used to say that my favorite answer in situations like this is, I don't know. but let me try to say a bit more. I think evolution has taken that time that we're asleep and basically having no concern about connecting it to our waking life. So all those memory tests I talked about that are being processed every night, all our memories from the day, probably every memory we have from the previous day is in some way viewed and altered during sleep. And I think the brain's evolution decided that it's just not going to make our consciousness privy to it. Partly because it would be too confusing. I mean, think about lower animals. Think about how lower animals must deal with dreaming if they are conscious than if they do dream, and must have much more difficulty distinguishing it from waking memories. If you have kids, you know that it takes a while for them to learn that those dreams didn't really happen. So I think evolution has decided that it's not smart for too much of that to leak into our waking knowledge. Now, remember, we remember dreams, but we remember very few of them. The best estimates are that we dream out of 8 hours, at least 6 hours. And if you remember 10 minutes or 15 minutes of dreams, you're lucky. Does that answer it, or is that still an I don't know answer?
It gets me a tiny bit away from the unknown toward the possibility. Yeah.
Mary?
I think to your first point, Bob, when you think about the stories patients with narcolepsy tell about that confusion, so they go right into dreaming, sleep a lot of the time, and they have confusion. Did this happen when I was awake? Did it happen when I was dreaming? And sometimes they do things by mistake because of that confusion. And so I think tucking away our dreams is part of how they work. I mean, if we're always doing this, if we're aware of what's going on, we need that separate time. It's like you need the time away from what's happening awake. And I think that's sort of part of the scope of what's going on.
Absolutely. Interestingly, a characteristic of people with narcolepsy is they, at a very high rate, like 80% of them, and very frequently, like once a week, wake up and remember a dream and are unsure whether it actually occurred or not. And we're talking about not you wake up in the morning and like for 30 seconds you're disoriented. We're talking about people who pack up and plan to move back home to another country because they'd been fired, when in fact nothing like that had happened. Lots of cases of people who dream that they have cancer and start preparing to die, and then go back to the doctor, and the doctor says, "What are you talking about?" They have dreams about family members dying and prepared to go home for the funeral only to discover that it didn't happen. So this is happening in something like 80% of narcoleptics on a weekly basis, and it's incredibly disruptive and probably destructive to their life. So we know that at that level, it's untenable.
Good. Anyone else? Well, this is one that came in, and actually it was something that the students in my class asked about also, that since so many of the bad effects, both physical health and mental health, are linked to sleep deprivation or poor sleep practices or poor sleep quality. And it seems to be settled science. Like each of you mentioned in your talk, you had a piece that talked about kind of loss of impulse control and that sort of thing. Why hasn't that found its way culturally into more serious public policy efforts? Or, and I'm reminded of a conversation on the news about someone who said, of a shooter, well, he was harmless. He played video games all night long. And I'm like, it doesn't sound like impulse control. So I'm not sure which.
So anybody can.
Can I take a stab at that?
Yeah.
So this is something that we grapple with all the time as to why it hasn't affected, public policy, but also funding, right? I mean, those of us who work on circadian rhythms and sleep are like, and Mariska can probably speak more to this even, but trying to find a place where we can send our grants to be supported, and because it doesn't tie neatly to a specific disease. I think that we're hurt. The fact that it actually is relevant to all diseases gets overlooked because we can't say, we're studying cancer or we are studying cardiovascular disease. But maybe Mariska can say more.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, Amita. And when you think about other conditions that are essentially analogous, right? When you think about physical activity and nutrition that have made it into the policy conversation. When you think about obesity and physical activity, the reason that it became such a big deal was because it was decided that obesity was a disease, right? And as Amita's pointing out, sleep outside of specific disorders like sleep apnea, insomnia, narcolepsy, it's not disease, but it is more about public health, right? And so when you think about those things, what are you going to do about it becomes the question, right? Because for seatbelts, right, the deaths for motor vehicle accidents, you can put on a seatbelt. For oral health, you can brush your teeth, right? For sleep, what are you going to tell people? Sleep more? You can, but it's not only those individual level factors, but it's also social and economic level factors that also impact sleep. Right? And so it's just taking it a little bit longer to get into that space of moving toward public policy and changing. But we are seeing the tide shift. We are seeing more of an awareness in the public space about sleep. Every individual in here sleeps, right? And so they know how important sleep is to them. But when you're thinking about institutionalizing sleep in the same level as physical activity or nutrition, that's just taking a little bit longer. Now, the science is there and the science is clear, but the movement of that science and the translation of that science to public policy is just taking time. But I do personally believe that we're at an inflection point where we will start seeing those changes.
I think that too. First of all, I think about smoking, which for decades felt like an intractable problem, even though everybody knew that smoking kills the people who smoke. We couldn't dent it. And then some sea shift came, and now smoking is so massively reduced. I think you're right about an inflection point. I think people are starting to understand that there are functions for sleep. I had a psychiatrist who called me once and said, Bob, I have a Harvard undergrad. He's got 2 papers that he got to get in by the end of the week. Is there any reason not to give him meds that will keep him awake? And I said, no, not really, unless you think sleep does something. And that's the point. Most people think that sleep cures sleepiness, and that's all it does. And that's like saying that the only thing that eating accomplishes is that it cures hunger. We know for all of the basic biological drives, eating, drinking, breathing, sexual activity, we understood their physiological function 1,000 years ago. But Alan Hobson, in the late 1990s, famously said the only known function of sleep was to cure sleepiness. And so there's this real belief. I have a friend who said, I used to need 8 hours of sleep, but then Starbucks came out with the Grande. And now I only need 6, because he equates not feeling sleepy in the morning with getting enough sleep. So we're doing the education, NIH is doing it, all of our research is trying to get across to people that sleep serves real active functions. And I think that's what we need to finally convince people. I mean, think about it. You can eat better. You can exercise better. Or you can sleep more. I mean, it should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. And to your point, I think there's a misconception between being alert and being healthy, right?
Yeah.
Because you can take a nap and get up and be cognitively fine, right? But it's not protecting your heart. It's not protecting your liver. It's not protecting your pancreas, right? And the research, the data clearly shows that.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on the idea of napping, and you mentioned that 90 minutes was the appropriate period for a nap in terms of memory consolidation and emotion. Do I get that right?
Well, as a scientist, I would say we've done experiments with 90-minute naps. And that gives you enough time to get to the end of the 90-minute cycle and get some REM sleep. And so a 90-minute nap, we see as much improvement on or Sarah Mednick actually is the person who's doing most of this work now out in California. The 90-minute nap will give you as much learning benefit as a whole night of sleep.
Because that was one of the questions about thinking about school schedules, is to build in a period for consolidation during the day through napping at the end of the school day or something like that. That's one of the questions that people had.
I think I'd rather, and I'd love to hear everybody
Yeah,
else's.
Mary, I
Mary,
think,
yeah,
will be
take
speaking
it.
to this, yeah.
So here's the thing. I mean, I don't think Bob was saying we should all nap for 90 minutes in the day. You think about it, if we construct our sleep or reconstruct it in interesting ways, we're harming other things. So it's not just learning, memory, and so forth that sleep supports, it's entire physiology and health. And you look at, we did a little study once with any college students in the room? So, we looked at their first 9 weeks of college, and we were having them tell us every single day, what is your sleep like? And we happened to get blood samples at the beginning and the end, and the kids in our group who had the shortest sleep and the most irregular sleep, when we looked at epigenetic age, ask your biology teacher, they got older. I mean, they got older than their chronological age. Those who slept most and most regularly, they got younger. They approached more their chronological age. So you wouldn't think of that necessarily as what sleep is doing, but it's all our health that's impacting. So short and irregular. So once we start throwing naps in, or I know you go online and you find these weird sleep schedules that are touted, you can sleep less if you only sleep 2 hours out of every 12 hours or out of every 8 hours. But they're doing it in a weird distribution. It's not helping. It isn't helping, and you can't do it. We did a study called Forced Desynchrony. It's like the kids are on a 28-hour schedule, so they can't entrain to that. Well, at certain circadian times, they're dead asleep on their feet. And so it's really this combination of factors, and if you start messing with them, you mess with all of your biology.
And to Mary's point, a lot of kind of what's in the public about sleep and the conversation, because that's where the research was in the beginning, was about sleep duration, how much, right? But that's not the only thing that's important. Amita talked about circadian rhythm, biological time, sleeping at the appropriate time, which is night. And not everyone can do that, right? We've heard about shift workers and things of that nature. Also, your sleep efficiency, right? The sleep quality. All of those things are important and variable in some cases. And all of those are what kind of equates to your sleep health.
So just to add to that, sleep need does vary from person to person. And so there are some people who can do with less sleep, but and the person I mentioned in my talk, David Dinges, has done a lot of work on this. He sleep-deprived medical residents, or I guess studied medical residents, they were sleep-deprived to begin with, and asked how they do on cognitive tests. And he said people fall into 3 categories based on how much sleep they need. But it doesn't correlate with what they themselves say about their sleep need. So a lot of people think they can do with less sleep, but they really can't.
Right. It was beautiful work by David, where he shows people like, I only need this much sleep.
Yeah.
And then they do the performance test, and they do horrible.
Yeah.
And the comment about sleep regularity, which is defined as basically sleeping at the same time every day. It turns out that sleep regularity is a better predictor, or poor sleep regularity is a better predictor of mortality than short sleep time. So it's not just getting enough sleep, it's getting it, and it's not so much the right time as the same time. Your brain and your body get in a habit. And sleeping, so college students who, goes to bed at 2 o'clock on weekdays and then goes to bed early on the weekend and sleeps until afternoon, they're not doing themselves a favor by having these highly irregular schedules.
And I would throw in there, as a circadian person, that regularity of meal times is also super important.
Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you actually about that. Is the regularity of sleeping important in part because we have so many timing mechanisms in our body and they need to be more or less in sync with each other?
They absolutely need to be in sync with each other, yeah. So in fact, and this is why I also threw in the comment about the meal times. So if you are, it turns out that the cues that your body clocks are responding to are different from what your brain clock is responding to. Then, your brain clock is most sensitive to light. Your body clock, like in your GI system or your liver, is more sensitive to the time of feeding. So if you're eating at the wrong time of day, then your liver clock is not in synchrony with your brain clock, and that has bad effects on its own. Yep. You want all the systems to be synchronized.
So lots of small meals isn't a good plan for the day?
As long as you still stop eating 3 hours before you go to bed, and not be eating at night, and yep.
Michael?
Yes, so I think instead of just talking about sleep and our need to sleep, I think we should actually look upon how it is to be awake. Because I think we all know if we have an enriching day, we have had some exercise, we feel on top of things, we sleep well. It's a symbiosis we have to. And the other thing I wanted to note is I think one of the things that really could push research forward and the importance and health concern is to develop a good biomarker for sleep. And maybe that should not be cognitive function, because I believe, I came from the side, and I believe that sleep is for the brain primarily. One night of sleep deprivation does not affect the other organs so much as the brain. We all know how lousy we feel. And I think if we had a biomarker that was basically on the housekeeping function of brain, that we have to, the brain, just think about the demand on you now. You have to sit here and focus, look on the right person, try to understand what this Danish accent is saying here. It's a tremendous requirement, and you're not allowed to do your housekeeping when you're awake. And that is why it's so important that we can sleep, because we have the metabolic, we have the cleaning, we have growth factors, we have all these things that have to be done. So to some extent, I totally agree with the memory testing and that, but maybe it has not served the sleep community that well to focus so much on memory testing. Instead of forcing in, it is a housekeeping function that we sleep. And if we had an objective marker of that, and could show, for example, beta amyloid is a wonderful marker. And we know that sleep deprivation increases beta amyloid. And we know if we keep increasing more and more, we actually sleep worse. And that, of course, is at least one of the reasons for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. If we could develop that, I think we had a much, much better argument to the public about the necessity of sleep.
So this is another question from the group. One of the few areas where we closely regulate sleep is in the transportation sector, airline pilots, commercial truck drivers, and so forth. But we tend to regulate the quantity of sleep rather than the quality of sleep. Is there a better way we should be measuring flying next to somebody who is flying from Seattle to Minneapolis to then fly a plane, and he commutes from Alaska for his job? Is there a better way we should be measuring that other than just the clock amount of time you've had between flights or something?
They are trying. As part of, and I'll get to it deeper when I give my presentation, but there is part of the function of my center is coordination for sleep and circadian activities across the federal government. And so we do have a interagency federal fatigue management research group where you have the Department of Transportation and components like the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, NHTSA, the Department of Highway Safety and Transportation, thinking about novel ways in order to measure sleepiness and fatigue. And so we probably won't get into it in my presentation, it's not there, but we've been having a conversation in an active area of research and investigation is sleep biomarkers, right? To be able to have a chemistry test, right? Like you have a test for alcohol, knowing that level, right? Some breathalyzer, right? Or some chemistry where you can say a person should be able to fly this plane or push that button or not. And so the short answer is yes, that there should be other metrics, and those, it is an active area of investigation across the federal government.
So yeah, actually, on that subject, some of us are very interested in developing these biomarkers where you can assess a person's sleepiness, just like you can do a person's alcohol level. In the interim, the FAA or whatever puts in these regulations, which aren't always optimal. So I spoke one time with pilots from United Airlines, and they told me that they hated the measures that were put into place to allow them to get more sleep. So what was happening was, I think this was on a flight to Japan or China, and they told me that when they get to China, they have to stay 2 days before they can come back. And the idea is that they would sleep in that time. But the truth of the matter is that they don't. And because A, you can't sleep at will, and B, you just might be out there doing other things. And so they said, and so that 2 days is worse than just 1 day. Because what it does is it partially shifts them to the China time and makes things even worse coming back. So I think a lot of consideration and thought needs to go into these policy.
Marish?
The one challenge with the biomarkers is they'll mark how, a breathalyzer, that's how much alcohol I have on board now. Well, that's going to dissipate with time. This biomarker for sleepiness, if you're staying awake, that's not going to dissipate with time. And so, you may know right now, but 10 hours from now, is it going to be worse? And the other thing is, I think the best models are combining, the time awake with circadian time and applying both systems to try and understand the fatigue issue.
Dr. Reese, Benjamin?
Yeah, just to add something from a historical perspective, there's a historian named Alan Derrickson who wrote a wonderful book called Dangerously Sleepy. I think the subtitle is The Cult of Manly Wakefulness. And he asked the question, why did, in the transportation sector, why did operators of trains and airline pilots, kind of get on board with the idea of regulating sleep cycles or downtime, whereas long-haul truckers didn't, and they fought it. And his answer was that the long-haul truckers are independent operators. They own their own rigs, and they have more of an investment in kind of controlling their own schedule and pushing themselves to the max. And so you get, songs about living on Reds, vitamin C, and cocaine, about, long-haul truckers, and there's a kind of economic incentive to resist those kinds of rules.
I'm curious, what's been done with the issue of apnea, and whether that is how people in the transportation industry with apnea are regulated, if they're regulated differently than others?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when you think about what Bob is talking about, sleep apnea, primarily obstructive sleep apnea, which is the most common. There are other forms, like central sleep apnea, other forms of sleep disordered breathing. But there have been, regulations and conversations about regulations to put in place, particularly for long-haul truckers, for people who drive trains. If you think about, some of the major accidents that have happened in Amtrak recently, that was due to untreated sleep apnea. When you think about Exxon Valdez, I think that was Bob. You gave examples about the Challenger and things of all that nature. That was because someone had sleep apnea that was untreated. And, to your point, there have been regulations, but for different sectors, depending on how they operate, like when you're talking about truck drivers, independent operators, they push back very, very, very hard because there is an economic incentive because you're cutting into their livelihood when you say, okay, you have apnea, you need to be treated, you can't drive this long, you have to do those types of things. And so there are activities and things about regulations or around regulations being developed, but it depends primarily on the industry and how the constituency of that industry operates and works.
Mary, did you want to say something? Or
Oh, this is so much fun. We haven't touched on another important issue, which is sleep inertia, which affects a lot of, not a lot, certain industries. First responders, for example, oh, the alarm's going off, get up and drive that fire truck. Well, there's this sleep inertia. This pressure to sleep is still there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, half hour after you wake up. And so, that kind of thing is another challenge that we all have to deal with this issue of sleep and sleepiness and fatigue.
We are at a time, I don't know about you, but I hope we are at that tipping point, because the pressing nature of the things that you're raising makes me proudly say that I sleep at least 8 hours every night. I mean, I really feel like I used to feel guilty about that, and I'm more and more saying we really need to acknowledge to ourselves and each other that we sleep, we need sleep. I'm a very good sleeper, I just want to say. I'm very proud of that. At any rate, we need to move on to the next thing so that we remain on our schedule, which is lunch. The options for lunch are in the program on page 18. Information about other things that you can do during this time period are on 18 and 19. And at 12:45, please do hit one of the many breakout sessions which are listed in your program. We're trying to make this a zero-waste conference. Please sort things. There are helpers to help you do that. Gustavus is a tobacco-free campus. If you want to smoke, you have to walk down the hill. For those of you online, there's a whole list of things that are going to be happening just for you. 1:45, we will begin with an organ prelude, and our first lecture of the afternoon and our only lecture of the afternoon is Mariska Brown, which will begin at 2.